The recent xenophobic attacks around South Africa have sparked a conversation around government's obligation towards immigrants. In a country burdened with high poverty and unemployment, is the state able to fulfill its constitutional obligations to foreign nationals? And does the presence of foreign nationals in the country contribute to the socio-economic challenges that the nation is facing? And joining me live from the Cape Town studio is immigration lawyer Gary Eisenberg. Good evening, Gary. And researcher internationalization at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, Savo Haleta, who's joining us via Skype. Welcome, Savo. Gary, let me start with you. What are the government's obligations, balance them, to foreign nationals versus to local citizens? Because most of the communities where the xenophobic violence has erupted have complained that they are left on their own, and people come into those communities, start businesses, and then jump queues, are given RDPs. These could be false allegations. We don't know, but that's how people see it. And also the complaints about porous borders around South Africa. So tell me about the obligations from a legal point of view.
Well, I think the right to human dignity belongs to everybody. The Bill of Rights in our Constitution doesn't differentiate between citizens and foreigners when it talks about human dignity, when it talks about due process of law, when it talks about equality of the law, when it talks about people who need emergency medical care. Foreigners and South Africans are treated absolutely equally in terms of our constitutional dispensation, a dispensation which South Africa worked very hard to have evolved into the document we have today and the kind of constitutional court we have sitting. So I think the disparity we're talking about is an economic disparity and a disparity of expectations. A lot of these foreigners set up businesses and compete head-on with people who have nothing in devastated townships, in previously disadvantaged communities. And the Department of Home Affairs, the Ministry of Police, and the Department of International Relations should all come together to try and diffuse these tensions. But it really has nothing to do with our Constitution. Everybody has the right to dignity and should be treated equally.
All right, should come together, but we've seen these xenophobic violence attacks occurring time and time again, and they are normally triggered by an incident or two. Now, Savo, let me hear your comment. What is the experience, you think, of the foreign nationals in South Africa, especially in the deprived communities?
I'd actually like to start talking about the experience of foreign nationals in South Africa. I'm a foreign national, white. I've never experienced any xenophobic incidents or violence. The violence and the incidents that are experienced by foreigners are primarily experienced by African immigrants who live in South Africa, as well as, in some cases, immigrants from Southeast Asia. So when we talk about xenophobia in South Africa and the problems when it comes to xenophobia, it really is an intersection of anti-black, anti-immigration, as well as Afrophobia. And this is something that always has to be taken into consideration. We cannot just define it as it is defined, like just a basic international definition. The problems are great, and I think, as the previous speaker has said, the problems are economic. At the end of the day, the issues that we see are happening in poor communities in South Africa, and it is understandable that poor South Africans are very angry. After more than 25 years of freedom and democracy, more than 60% of South Africans, mainly black South Africans, live in absolute poverty. And very often the people next door, people who they see doing something to make a living and struggling very hard to make a living, are their neighbors, immigrants or migrants, migrants from other parts of South Africa or immigrants from other parts of the continent mainly. And this is where competition comes. We see this in the past few days where The problems are, there are numerous problems in Alex, and authorities who should be there addressing the communities are not there. And when anger builds up, again, the people who experience the problems are the people on the ground. And I think at the end of the day, the issues, as we said, are economic, and the reasons for poverty and extreme inequality in this country are rooted in colonial and apartheid exploitation and oppression, as well as the failure to bring about redress after 94.
Sure, and I want to raise a question about management of immigration at the border posts of the country, what the situation is there, because there's also talk and complaint about the migration into South Africa by undocumented immigrants, but we'll discuss that in a moment. Haley, you're joining us in Johannesburg. Welcome, Haley.
Hi, good evening, sir, and to you and to your guests. Thank you for taking my call. I really appreciate it.
Welcome.
I am a refugee for 23 years living in South Africa. Look, many of my fellow refugees, they create the job. They never take nobody's job. What I see and I blame and condemn the leadership and the South African government for this blaming of the migrant due to the economic crisis at the moment for the sake of the political election in the country. Because the South African politicians, they loot the country, their own country, as you see the history, from the village councillor to the premier or from any one of them. When I see with my experience, I'm also politicians, I see what is happening in a country. They blame on the migrant every time come. They're creating the conflict in between a very good fellow South Africans. Look, I really appreciate South Africans is the very generous people. In my experience, very good people. We don't have a refugee camp. They give us place to stay. They give us food to eat. When we come here, we don't have nothing to be established, but we struggle to create a job and to, you know.
So Haley, if I understand you, you're saying, therefore, from your point of view and experience, the conflict between South Africans and foreign nationals is stoked by politicians, local, provincial, and national.
Exactly. Look, let me tell you, from the parliament, if you see, as a refugee, I see the government act every time, every 5 years, every minister comes, they're very negative towards the refugees. Look, the refugees, if you go to the world, the United States of America is a nation of the refugees and the foreigners. That country become the great nation in the world because of the migrant.
Sure.
When in South Africa, we have a great intellectual, great dynamic, you know, the high-profile migrant due to the business or with education. So they don't know how to handle this migrant, but they are the signatory of the Geneva Convention.
Haley,
the hatred starts on the office side. Yes, I'm listening.
I got your points. Thank you for talking to us. We appreciate it. And Gary, let me pose this question to you then, or firstly, allow you to respond to what Haley is saying before I pose the question.
I think the gentleman is wise, and I think his comments are absolutely on point. Most countries, most successful countries, are countries who have absorbed and who continue to absorb immigrants. I want to say this, that xenophobia is not only a product of economics. I think it's endemic. And as an immigration attorney practicing 6 days a week for the last 24 years in this country, immigration law, I have seen xenophobia manifest itself in a decline in quality of decision-making on the part of the Department of Home Affairs on ordinary immigration applications. I'm not even talking about how refugees are handled in terms of the Refugees Act. I think there's a latent xenophobia endemic within our ranks, within the Department of Home Affairs, and I think that should be cleansed, and the Department of Home Affairs should be restructured and retrained to deal with immigrants in a more efficient and humanitarian way.
What is going on at the border posts in the first place? I mean, we've had some of the politicians complain. Let's say the mayor of Joburg here, Herman Mashaba, saying that in his party, DA, also saying that they will tighten the border controls because they think they are lax. Is that your sense? And again, ordinary folk in the streets in those deprived communities, impoverished communities, are saying that, you know, the numbers are too high and they see this at hospitals and other places where public services are being provided, and that this places a burden and presents a competition for those services?
I have no doubt whatsoever that important border posts like Beit Bridge continue to be hounded by extreme corruption. With regard to the Zimbabwean crisis, we've had millions of Zimbabweans cross the border. Child trafficking is taking place. Often there's bribery and corruption at Beit Bridge like never before. That has never been able to be properly managed. But I think with regard to border enforcement by the army and by the police, Buthelezi started speaking about this almost 20 years ago, and I don't think South Africa has got that right yet. But I think far more work can be done to limit the risk beyond our borders and to close our borders and to manage it far more carefully than South Africa has ever been able to do in the past. Get rid of corruption, train our officials to be more law-abiding, and let due process take its course. And I think South Africa would be in a far better position vis-à-vis foreigners than it has been up until now.
Now, Savo, coming to you, what is the actual situation in terms of numbers of foreigners here in South Africa? Do you have a sense from the research you've done? Because the numbers, bandied about are that there could be a number as high as 5 million undocumented foreign nationals here in South Africa, particularly those from other African countries. So what do you know about that? So
what we can take as a starting point is the 2011 census. And the 2011 census tells us that in 2011, there were 2.2 million foreigners living in South Africa. Since then, the estimation by the Statistics South Africa is that additional 1.1 million people have come to South Africa. We also have to take into consideration that South Africa is one of the top countries that kicks foreigners out of the country. So since 2011, according to the Department of Home Affairs, about 400,000 people, mainly Africans from other African countries, have been deported from South Africa. So what that gives us at this point, according to the numbers that we have, not hearsay, the numbers and the stats from the government of South Africa as well as Statistics South Africa, is that we're talking about 2.8 million people. That is about 5% of the South African population.
Now,
so
let me ask you this question. Earlier you made a statement that what is being presented as xenophobia actually is predominantly Afrophobia, right? And we agree that this is happening in, again, those poorer communities in South Africa. But there's something going on in those communities. The residents themselves open their homes and their properties to foreign nationals who end up trading there. So to your mind, Savo, what is it, or from your research, what is it that sparks the conflicts, the xenophobic violence that we see erupting time and again, if the very foreign nationals were received into those communities by local South Africans who have rented their properties to them in the first instance?
I believe I've looked at very closely in the past few months at what are South African politicians as we approach the elections. What are they saying about immigration and about foreign nationals and all that? And it is very hard to find a political party in South Africa that doesn't use xenophobia and the belief that South Africans don't like foreigners as a tool for campaigning. From the DA to the ANC to other political parties, foreigners are blamed for the high crime in South Africa. But if we look at the stats, how many foreigners are in prisons, that's the only way we can actually tell who is committing crime in this country. Only 8% of prisoners in this country in 2016 were foreign nationals. The rest were South Africans. So if we look at the research that shows us what are foreign nationals doing when it comes to economic activity, as some of the previous speakers have said, they create their own job opportunities. And in many cases, they employ South Africans. In some other cases, as you said, they rent from South Africans. They pay VAT like everybody else in this country pays VAT. So they contribute to this country. And I would, in my through my research and my conversations with people, it comes down to interest of politicians and leaders, whether they are local or national, to stoke this. Because after 25 years, if you are the ruling party or you are in the Western Cape running the province, how do you explain your failures? You find a way to blame somebody else so that you don't take the blame. Somebody else will take the blame. And we see this in Durban, we see this in Alex, and we'll see it probably elsewhere.
Savo Haleta, the conflict transformation and management researcher at Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. Thank you very much for having been our guest. And Gary Eisenberg, immigration lawyer based in Cape Town, thanks again for having been our guest from our studios there. Up next, we remember the legendary musician Hugh Masekela. He would have turned 80 years old yesterday, and we'll be talking to his friend and manager about his legacy.